again, who would have thought that it was raining when they said today was supposed to be the nice day, right? So I do have a little bit of housekeeping to take care of first, and then we'll get into the introduction. We are taking pictures of this event, and so and we will upload those pictures to the Our Community Reads and to the Friends of the Scotts Valley Library social media outlets. If you don't want your picture taken, please let our photographers know. I think we have a couple photographers in here tonight, or anybody with this lovely white badge, and we will make sure that your picture is not taken, or if it is, that it gets deleted off of our digital media accounts. We're happy to honor your wishes. So Dr. Flagg Miller is a professor of religious studies at the University of California, Davis. His research focuses on cultures of modern Muslim reform in the Middle East, and especially in Yemen. Having done field work as a cultural anthropologist in one of the southern Yemen's chief coffee production areas during the mid-1990s, he has initiated a project on Yemeni coffee that involves Yemenis and Yemeni Americans who are currently coffee growers and merchants. But due to the war, he's been unable to visit Yemen in recent decades, but has conducted field work and research coffee in South Africa and has explored Yemen's legacies in that country in particular. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Flagg Miller as he talks to us about the role coffee plays in human culture.
All right, well, thank you, Judy. And it's such an honor to be here. It's great to, I love talking about Yemen, and I can't express my gratitude enough to those who have, to all of you who chose this book, Monk of Mocha, to read. And so, has anybody been to Yemen? So Yemen was a place you could go to some years ago. Hopefully it will be, I'm sure one day it will again be that. So I'll show you, I'm going to move you through some pictures I took while I was in Yemen, and then move right into a talk that's going to be about Islam and Islam's role in Yemen and the development of coffee through history. Here is some coffee from Yemen. It's not the coffee bean, but it's the coffee cherry that has been dried. And it's the main thing Yemenis drink is the pulped up, dried cherry around the coffee. And they also drink bean, but that's what I'll talk about. But anyway, so I'm going to pass this around so you can smell it. And you'll see it's pretty distinct. So I'll just start here. The music you were just hearing is available on YouTube. It's Fuad al-Kibsi, and he's an amazing Yemeni musician. So if you get the name, come up and talk to me. All right, so for some 200 years, Yemen was at the center of the coffee world. That was the 16th to the 18th centuries. It was the sole provider of coffee globally, and not many people know that at all. And it remains a place that coffee has grown, although not as it once was. Moreover, Yemen is where the agricultural development of coffee first happened in history. And that was sometime before the 14th century. Yemen, here's a little map. So you can see Yemen, here's Africa, here's the Red Sea, lots of shipping, as we know about, we hear all the time. Historically, Aden down here was the port for the British for 130 years. That was their shipping, refueling port. So there was a colonial colony down there. But, up here in the highlands is the capital of Yemen, Sana'a. And down here, for many years, there was North and South Yemen. And there was a border, and this was the Cold War era. But I did a lot of my work in South Yemen, in an area called Yafa, and that's one of the prime coffee growing areas. Here is pictures of Sana'a. Now, Sana'a is the oldest city on the Arabian Peninsula. It's the oldest continuously inhabited place on the entire Arabian Peninsula. So, you'll see the architecture here goes back hundreds, if not 1,000 plus years. It's it reflects all the Yemenis and Arabians brought to civilization very early. And these are 9 or 10-story buildings. Here are some kids that you can see lots of different races and many happy children. I saw all the time. There are gardens inside the city. You know, coffee is grown in this, although Sana'a is a little bit chilly, so there's not a ton of it. But there's a lot of agricultural production because of the high mountains up in this area around Sana'a, and much of Yemen get up to be, 11,000 feet. And so the rain comes in and falls, and the mountains produce crops, and this has gone on for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years. And people think of the Arabian Peninsula as dry, but this was a source of spices for the Roman Empire. All their temples, the myrrh and the frankincense, as well afterwards as so many other different cultures. Here's a little picture of some of the steep mountains, the farming that goes up there, and it's still very traditional. This guy's using a hand plow. Here is the region where I work. I'm just going to kind of move quickly through this and then get to the coffee talk. And you can see the road in there is perilous. And as I climbed my first trip up in here, I was not sure there'd be much at the end of the road. But once you get up into the highlands, you find these terraced farms, have thousands of years history, and it's fertile, and there's coffee, and this is all coffee grown. It's all smallholder areas where it's often horticulture, so there are different kinds of plants grown around. So it's also, this is the traditional way, a lot of sustainable smallholder farms. Well, that's all coffee in the valley. And it's changed, so with cash cropping, and including the U.S.'s role in exporting wheat. From as early as 1959, as part of the UN-backed kind of structural reform and food and agriculture policies, and the World Health Organization, the trade organizations, part of the U.S.'s engagement in that country to help it modernize, involved really coaxing people away from traditional farming into consuming American imported wheat, which today is mostly, it's like 90% of what Yemenis rely on for food is imported into the country. So it's part of the devastation that modernization of the global system has brought, which is kind of like why the Houthis have risen to power, because they, finally, in fact, they came to power in September of 2014. In August of 2014, 1 month before, the World Bank imposed an agreed structural reform that caused the tariffs on fuel to be cut, and the fuel prices skyrocketed. And the government, hadn't been given enough time to explain to people and show the people what the rewards would be. Huge mistrust, massive outbreak of protests, and just excruciating pain. And that's exactly when the Houthis took advantage of the moment and took power. So these kinds of dynamics involve us here, and they're things that we can learn more about, which is so great that you've read this book and kind of can understand how much Yemen itself has to offer. We're talking about coffee today. So these are reservoirs that Yemenis have built up in these incredible highlands that are hundreds and hundreds of years old, where they, this was a dry year, clearly. At some point with the rains, these used to fill up, and the women work hard drawing water to irrigate. So it's labor intensive. Here is I'm chewing gut. which is a famous Yemeni plant. It's like a stimulant. It's like tobacco, kind of relaxes you, and you can sit back, and the coffee is here, always with gut. And, you know, these are friends of mine. It happens every day in Yemen. Lots of socializing, water pipes, drinking coffee. There's the requisite coffee container and chewing pot. And Yemenis, like my book, focused a lot on poetry, political poetry. So there'd be political events like this. Yemen's all tribal, and so this is a particular, I lived in the area that's the largest tribe in southern Arabia, Yafa, and this was an event, and people came, and it was like one of the most powerful men in the country was here that day, but it was just after the war in '94, and so people came, and he'd been on the other side of the war, so they wanted to demonstrate that they were warriors and could fight if an occasion came again. So there's a lot of weapons in Yemen. I was part of the rituals that were involved in daily life, and so it was a moment really just to never forget. So I'm hoping that some of us can get to Yemen again. But today's goals are this: how Islam has been integral to coffee's development, why Islam has been so integral to coffee's development. Number 3, how all this matters to Yemeni American coffee merchants today. And number 4, how recentering Islam in the story of coffee can help improve relations between Yemen and America. So number 1, how Islam has been integral to coffee's development. So first of all, so many of the historic centers for coffee growing were Muslim countries. So we're talking Yemen, Ethiopia, Java, Sri Lanka, and Ceylon at one point, India. Those were the early major coffee producing areas. All Muslim, India has a significant Muslim population, but the others, large numbers of Muslims. And nearly 1 in 4 people today in the world are Muslim. So demographic-wise, Islam remains very important to this global commodity and how it works. But coffee was not around at the time of the Prophet Muhammad in the 8th century when Islam arose. So there's no mention of coffee in the Quran or anything like that. It arose later. Now, wild coffee is grown in Ethiopia forever, but as I say, speculation, there are historical records that begin to talk about some kind of a wild berry in Arabia as well that was being crushed and eaten or drunk around the 8th or 9th centuries. And it's hard to know what the berry was. It was said to have a delightful, stimulating effect. But more concrete evidence begins to accumulate. 2 of these stories about a monk of Mocha that you've read about, the port city of Mocha. And they kind of anchor around the 13th or 14th century. And the traditional story is rooted in Arab historical accounts. There was a man, he was driven out of town for his unorthodox teachings. He almost died of hunger, but drank coffee and flourished and was made a saint. And so who was this 13th, 14th century guy? Well, there are different accounts. There are at least 3 different individuals identified in historical records. The most famous is the one mentioned in Dave's book, Ali ibn Omar al-Shadili. And the Shadili is a group of Sufis, the Shadiliya, one of the most famous Sufi groups. So the Sufis are Muslims who approach the Quran in a way of kind of reading it more allegorically, but also looking for hidden inner truths. It's kind of a mystical path, but it's also very much in a orthodox, like lots of Muslims find Sufism in a way integrated without being the isolated mystic in the desert. And it involves very close teachings between a leader, a sheikh, and a student, which is, how you're kind of brought into knowing more about what the Quran or its religion is telling you. And their famous Sufi singing and dancing and kind of aesthetic traditions and so forth. So coffee was very much part of that world. And there are two interesting variations in the accounts of this mocha mocha, where again, different individuals identified as that. But they all focus on a couple of things. So one is that the coffee that he prepared, at least in one account, wasn't the coffee bean, but it was gat. It was a gat drink, which is what I was chewing there, and not the coffee arabica at all. So the second interesting thing is one of the stories is about a guy who kind of gets sick. He's and then he remembers having been in Ethiopia and seen Ethiopia's chewing on and drinking the plant, the bean, and so he remembers that, drinks it, and gets well, and then others learn from that. So those stories indicate a couple things, that in the 13th, 14th century, coffee was kind of just beginning to be a thing that people recognized, and it was unclear as to exactly what the plant was or what its origins were. Safe to say there were competing accounts, and that's what history kind of shows us. Different cities, different families, they wanted to all kind of take part in this story, so that's what we see. Now, coffee, the thing is, though, that early accounts of Sufis drinking coffee, Arabica, tell that there were special ceremonies, and they would involve group prayer and chanting the names of God, in which they ladled out coffee and passed the cups around to the right, reciting that there is no God, God alone, the master, the clear reality. So coffee was part of worship from that early on. Okay, so then the custom of drinking coffee in the historical record is quickly found in sources talking about its arrival in Mecca in 1511, in Damascus shortly afterwards, in Istanbul in 1555, and the Ottomans there were all Sufis, in Cairo. So the point is of all this is that coffee arose nearly 1,000 years after the advent of Islam. Now, for Muslims, telling the story of coffee would become very much one about religion itself and how coffee could help teach them to be more pious. One story tells of Solomon, who was the first to discover coffee and grind it and offer it to others. Suleiman in the Quran, King Solomon. And the story is he was traveling, he came to a town of disease-ridden people, and God told him, here's this plant, to prepare it, and give it to people, and they will heal. And indeed they did. Coffee was said to be a curative for smallpox in the Muslim sources. It was really interesting. Measles, wow. And a cold and coughs. So, the way it was prepared, the way it was served, it could be pretty powerful. It's not just the stories of these kind of, but also some of the medical reports of what was happening, why it was valued. Anyway, another early story, aside from King Solomon, was that there was a man who had a dream in which the prophet Muhammad appeared to him. And he was so excited, he asked the prophet if the prophet could give him some wisdom that he could take back and share with his friends. And the prophet said, I'll do better than that. I'll give you 3 things to remember. And he said, the first two are kind of a lot of details, but they involve, first of all, how to use rosary beads in an especially beneficial way. The second one was how to visit saints' tombs in a particular way. And the third one was that as long as even the faintest flavor of coffee lingers on your tongue, the angels will intercede for you. And actually, the second one about visiting saints' tombs was, if you visit saints' tombs, boil an egg and eat it at the saints' tombs. And that will also help the saints intercede for you. So eggs, coffee, rosary beads, keys to paradise. So that was the guy's dream. Holy sayings often come in threes, pattern Islamic teachings. A 16th century Yemeni scholar named Abu Muhammad al-Hebshi said that God bestowed in three invaluable blessings upon those who died after the Prophet Muhammad. And the three blessings are, number one, a 14th century book in which Ibn Abad al-Rundi is kind of talking about the wisdom of Ibn Ata'Allah al-Askandari, and it's a whole book about that. These are Sufis commenting on Sufis about their wisdom. So that's the first one. The second one is a collection of poetry of an esteemed poet from Yemen named Omar al-Makrama. And the third is al-Qahwa al-Buniyya, or coffee. So coffee, in Al-Habshi's account is kind of really important, right? And these three things encapsulate for Habshi what he said, what so many Muslims knew before but may have forgotten. And with these supplies, that is 2 books and a cup of joe, people could do what they previously had not been able to do. Aside from books and stories, there are important Islamic rituals involving coffee that have been passed down through the generations. And there are many, but I'll talk about just a few. There's one ritual in Hadramaut in Yemen that's really neat. It happens every year. There's a period of 7 days in which people in the community get together. They divide the Quran up into 7 parts. And at night, after the night prayer, they get together and they start to recite. They do that collectively, a 7th of the Quran, and then go to sleep. And that takes a long time. And at about 2 or 3 in the morning, coffee is served to people as they recite the Quran and linger through the night. And there's an adage: when coffee cups start to jingle, shaitan, that is the devil, runs away. And that's said by a famous Hadrami Yemeni scholar in the 18th century. And the idea is when you don't have energy and you're yawning and getting lazy, that's when the devil strikes you. Often the devil said to come in through your mouth. And so coffee is the elixir. There are coffee prayers in Islam. This one is a prayer modeled on the first chapter of the Quran, the Fatiha. And it says, and one says this, one can say it before drinking coffee or lots of other things. I recite the Quran's opening chapter for all the great scholars of brown coffee, the Alawite masters, the Sufis, and every saint, male and female, and anyone who drinks it with the intention that God may rectify their inner being and fulfill religious and worldly needs by the honor of the best of creation. And it goes on, addressing friends and family and loved one. It's beautiful and detailed. So those are all kind of how coffee mattered in Islam and why it was important. Now I'm going to talk about why Islam has been integral to coffee's development. And the first thing to say, of course, is that coffee is a surprising pleasure. Now, for religious conservatives, that was potentially a problem. There were worries that arose consistently over all kinds of foods and drinks, whether they, were too passionate and intoxicating. But that said, Islam is not a religion that expects people to deprive themselves of the pleasurable things that nature has created and made available. In fact, according to the Quran, the paradise will have rivers of wine, delicious to the drinkers. And historically, Muslim societies have shown quite a bit of tolerance for foods and drinks that have euphoric effects. Islamic law tends not to prohibit anything, except if it's explicitly in the Quran or Islamic legal tradition, banned or said to be prohibited. Otherwise, it's generally permissible. The Quran, all it really says about, that might apply to coffee or to a substance that could be prohibited is a verse that says, "And do not bring about your destruction with your own hand." But it's pretty vague, and again, bans on early coffee were not Muslim alone. They happened in Italy in the 16th century. Catholic prelates would ban coffee as well for similar kinds of reasons. The historical record talks about a ban in Mecca in 1511, where there was a kind of a Mamluk Pasha who kind of criticized coffee's use because he had been on a thing against alcohol, and then they thought, well, maybe I'll carry this over to coffee as well. But it's only mentioned in one source. Other edicts in the Muslim world kind of came along at various points, but the fact that they kept arising signaled that they weren't followed very carefully, that people kept drinking, and it kept being an issue. So Muslims really did, on the whole, find ways to continue enjoying and celebrating. And the reason is, of course, coffee is in many respects healthy. The beverage, as I said, was seen to be an actual medicine for coughs, colds, for various diseases, bloody skin eruptions, helping the liver by just getting liquids through the body. And it was also a social lubricant. These are all pictures of scenes from coffee houses through Muslim history, where people are enjoying themselves, talking in Jerusalem in the 19th century. And often it was a male-centered universe for coffee. That has changed recently, but here there's backgammon and cards, and that's the Ottoman world of here's Damascus storytelling. The idea was, yes, these men were getting together, but they were often men of all different social classes, especially in the Ottoman world. And this was tremendously exciting. Coffee had this kind of magic to it was affordable and something equally enjoyable by many. It was good for married couples. More than one community saw it as conducive to sexual health. Good for newlyweds to help them stay awake, alert, and active. And so Muslim dowries that the bride would often take with her to her husband's home, just moving in, would often contain coffee paraphernalia. Now, sometimes Muslim scientists would be a little more cautionary. They would say it depends on who you are, there can be pre-existing conditions. It may accentuate those. They can be mental, they can be physical. Back then there were kind of humors of, that was an old Galenic Roman theory of medicine, and so people with a dry temperament were said to possibly find coffee leading them to melancholy. For others it could keep them up awake at night and actually decrease the libido. It depended. Now, I think that's fair. Coffee has over 2,000 different chemicals in the bean. It's an incredibly complex, plant. And what activates coffee are fats. And so coffee has no nutritional value, but when you drink it and you have fats, and those fats range all kinds of fats, and each of us is quite different in our composition, plus the other things we're eating. And those fats are what pull out the particular chemicals of a coffee bean. So the kind of ways in which one person can get something quite different from the same cup of coffee from another is it's actually quite wide, actually. And UC Davis just founded a coffee center in which they're doing a lot of incredible experimenting and stuff on coffee. So that's exciting. And I'm learning a lot too. Okay, so why Islam has been central to coffee. Okay, so I talked a little bit about Muslims' perceptions. I think that we often in the West we got kind of mixed messages about what coffee was as it arrived in Europe and England and in the 16th century and so forth. It was often seen to be a plant from Arabia, and sometimes the health benefits were recognized and commended to British drinkers. Here, for example, in the 1674 broadsheet, the title of this was A Brief Description of the Excellent Virtues of that Sober and Wholesome Drink called Coffee. And there's a sketch of an Arabian coffee tree, there's a poem, and it extols the health benefits of coffee as used and its uses by Yemenis and Arabians, and urges propriety and care and use with rules and orders in the public coffee houses in England, because they were actually pretty rough. And so coffee could be something, that had some culture with it. And, perhaps some Islamic culture. Of course, there were the old stereotypes and racial categorizations as well. So, Hasbro Rose's 1652 London coffee house was called the Turk's Head. It's a pub today in London. That's the sign on the lower right with a sword. This was a 1671 broadsheets, new and curious treatments using coffee, tea, and chocolate. And you have the three kind of peoples from the continents of Asia, this Muslim drinking coffee, China drinking tea, and South America drinking cocoa, chocolate. So some of those racializing categories are passed along. Now, how this matters for Yemeni American coffee merchants today. So I talked about kind of how Islam was important to coffee's development and why. And now we're fast forward to my work with coffee today in the United States. So I was in Dearborn, Michigan this past September. It was a 33rd commemoration of Yemeni Unification Day. And I did an interview while I was there with the vice president of the University of Michigan Dearborn's Yemeni Students Association, Gamal Mujeli. And I asked him, how are young Yemeni Americans doing these days? And Gamal said, well, actually there's a room for improvement. Our generation has become more insular and isolated than our parents' generation was. And not just because of COVID. Let's see. And he said that quite a few Yemeni Americans are spending more time with each other than did their parents, and that's great. So that lots of more younger generations are spending time with other Yemeni Americans. So that's good, but the problem is, he said, is that they're not learning how to circulate outside of those circles as much as their parents did. And so they don't have friend groups that are, can kind of carry them out of those groups. And so as a result, they've become more handicapped when it comes to interacting with non-Yemenis. And this in turn, he said, affects how they behave with one another. He felt like they'd become more divided and more focused unhealthily on small differences between one another, sadly sowing seeds of judgmentalism and cliquishness. And Gamal has made addressing this problem a big part of what he does as a student activist. And I think that he's, the bigger context of that, of course, is the war in Yemen and how divisive it's been for Yemenis. But it's also part of a, generation of young people, and Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, in the wake of 9/11, and just all the stresses they're facing. So enter the coffee shop. Okay, it's a place to gather for different kinds of people and ages. Now, he's not saying this, I'm saying that what I saw in Dearborn was a flourishing of coffee shops, unlike I'd ever seen in Dearborn. I mean, and I went to grad school at the University of Michigan, so I spent a lot of time there. But in the last 10 years, across Dearborn, but also the United States, and here's local, this is all in our neighborhood, Yemeni coffee shops have taken off, and they are extraordinarily sophisticated. The kind of coffee you can get there is the direct trade stuff, but it's also prepared in all of these ways that teach you a lot about the ways Yemenis make coffee, and so you can drink the powder I pulled around that's called kisher in Yemen, which is not the coffee bean, but the fruit. You can taste what that's like there. You can taste regional varieties, and there are lots within Yemen, lots of spices. So, and so what I learned was that because of the war in Yemen now, many, and this is, it's made the return to Yemen harder for the older generations who had worked their whole lives in the United States and hoped to return and retire there. A thing, but they realized that it just is not going to happen. So they have decided to use their life savings instead to invest in their own neighborhoods, build up businesses. The coffee shop is one of the things that many are doing, and so it's an extraordinary moment. There's a lot going on in Yemeni American communities now, and this anyway. So the coffee shop is one now. I asked the owner of the Jerez Coffee House. This is its location in San Francisco. I asked him about whether the extent to which these cafes are able to bring the history of, I call it Islamic coffee, to their product. And he said, it's, he said, my cafes are aimed at everyone. Hispanics, whites, blacks, Arabs. My cafes are the most diverse in Dearborn. He was in Dearborn at that point. And coffee unites people, he said. It brings people together. And he described how he hosts Christmas carolers in the winter holiday season, decorates for Halloween, and yes, also welcomes Muslim families during Eid. And he also said the following: most of the Arab American clientele who frequent his cafes are not Yemenis, because they can make their coffee at home. Most of them are from outside of Yemen. They're Arab Americans who, the main reason they like his shop is because they're single, well-educated, upwardly mobile people who can find other like-minded folks and make friends with, and even indeed become lifelong partners. And he added, what, are you going to go to a bar, get drunk, and find some other drunk person who's going to be your future husband? No! That's not what people at his cafes come to do. So it was an interesting and lovely quote. I think that it's my kind of gateway into recognizing that that is a Muslim sentiment that has a long history in like how Muslims talked about the value of coffee in a world where there were other seductions around, and the value for marital couples or just people and socializing. So when we think about Islamic coffee, these shops have trouble or kind of aren't ready to call their coffee Islamic because it just doesn't sell well, right? And it evokes kind of concerns, sadly. But I want to help us today think through what Islam continues to bring to coffee production and what it can do for not only Muslims, but all of us. For Hamza Nazar, the value of coffee in being a social lubricant comes from connecting with people in meaningful relationships that are based on ethics of mutual respect. And in Islam, these traditions of an ethics of mutual respect are called adab. They have a long history. There are early books on etiquette, basically, that arose in the first centuries of Islam's expansion. And they focused on how to speak properly, how to behave toward others, how to dress appropriately, and so forth. Much of which all of these lessons were designed to help Muslims navigate new cultural worlds in which, while one might not be engaging with others of equal rank, status, tribe, or even religion, one could nevertheless make new friends and win allies based on certain trans-cultural and ecumenical standards of ethical conduct. Let me share with you a few other ways in which Islam's adab is practiced in Yemeni American coffee culture, particularly in contexts in which they're making new inroads in American society. So recently I was chewing khat and drinking coffee and enjoying an afternoon with Yemeni Americans in Salinas. And they're dancing, and here we're chatting, and they told me something interesting. They said, when a Yemeni arrives in the US and they're looking for work, they don't yet have a job or permanent residence, so what do? So they move around, they stay for short periods of time with relatives and friends, and there's a tradition that's called giving taho, or coffee. What does that mean? Well, everyone who hosts the new arrival gives $100 to them and to help them along the way. And over time, as everybody contributes a little taho, a little coffee, they get their feet and they're able to find a new way in this new culture. Another example of adab, of this kind of etiquette in navigating cultural boundaries, is this WhatsApp video. It's short. It was shared to me with me by a friend at Dearborn on that commemoration day, who sadly wouldn't attend the event because he felt it was too many Yemenis there celebrating unity under the rubric of kind of northern Yemen's vision for Yemen. And there are southern Yemenis who really feel like there's no way that Yemen can unify. It needs to separate. The two countries have to separate. This is the thing. This is like the big issue. And there are governments and world powers standing behind that kind of, we're very much, supportive. Oh, well, anyway. So, sadly he just wouldn't attend. But he did share this video. And whatever you'll see, it's just about a minute long. The segment you'll hear begins with a poem by a 17th century poet in Yemen that says, Yahya Omar, that's his name. Yahya Omar says, if only India were in Jaffa, or Jaffa were in the land of Hindustan. So that little verse, which starts this off, is transculturalism at work. So it's this and you'll see 8 scenes of coffee, and you'll see lots of kind of ways in which Yemenis are sharing this etiquette of sociality. And partly it's in this imagination of a connectedness with India, which Yemen had tons of history of connections there. Lots of Yemenis went to India. And it's a connection with Hindustan, like the Hindu world. And so like coffee is part of that thing that connects India and Arabia historically. But it's also a chance for this poet to say, it can be a kind of a method that we use to enjoy ourselves. And you'll see scenes of rituals of courtship here, as we've learned, so important to the owner of the Jerez Coffee House. You'll see someone invoking God, another part of etiquette. You'll see them treating the land properly with care and respect. It's another kind of the etiquette of care, tribal honor, honoring the ancestors, managing the pleasures of music, dance, and the sharing of a beautiful meal. So those are all things you'll see real quick. And just one note, you'll see a red turbaned tribal sheikh who appears repeatedly in this video. And he is Sheikh Fadl al-Naqib, who is really the paramount sheikh of all of the largest tribe in all of South Arabia. And so he's a very powerful guy. So he's handling coffee. You'll see him a few times. And he is a major mediator in the Afghan politics. So he's the tribal guy that is a huge political figure. And he looks very charming and endearing here, and he is. He's the sweetest guy. I know him personally very well. His ancestors were all the sultans of this region, and their most revered religious allies were Sufis from eastern Yemen in the Hadramaut. They were Alawi Sufis, a religious brotherhood with venerable connections to Jaffa. And the tribe used to grow coffee and give it to the Sufis out in the desert. And the Sufis then would come and visit and shower their blessings on this. So coffee was So you'll see how much that history remains part of how Yemenis are envisioning, not just both the possibility for social existence among themselves as Yemenis who feel a lot of conflict, but also with others like Hindus and other people from different cultures. So here we go. Okay. So this was made just a few years ago. This is this beautiful area where I did all my field work. Yeah, the Omar called, I wish that India was in Yafat, or Yafat, we're in the lands of Hindustan. Here's the Sheikh, here's the coffee. God, Allahu Akbar. Here's the agriculture, hard work. Coffee and the Sheikh and coffee. Tribal tradition. Honor, defending one's community, ancestry, passing on the lineage. Coffee, here, music, pleasure. We're eating and sharing a meal. This is all sorghum growing. These are coffee fields. Traditional tribal dance. More courtly dancing and music, coffee, courtship, the Sheikh. Okay, so that's the whirlwind tour. I showed this to my son, and he just was like, when was this made? And I said, just a few years ago. And he was like, how is that even possible that Yemen is so beautiful and can be like that? And what we hear is so opposite. And I've talked with Yemenis too, and they're like, you know what? Yemen has these multiple worlds. And you go there today, and you go there tomorrow, and you can experience this. There are parts of the country where it's like this, and other places where bombs are falling. And so, there we go. Okay, so, so we basically covered a little bit of like three sites in which Islamic adab is helping Yemeni Americans build solidarity amidst cultural and political tensions. And the final part of my talk is just how recentering Islam in the story of coffee can help improve relations between Yemen and America. I think it's important to help celebrate not just Yemeni coffee, but also what it can teach people about what Islam is, and how Yemeni Americans are contributing to coffee's past, present, and future as Muslim Americans. What do we learn? There's something, first of all, there's something called adab. And it's Islamic in the sense that it's about navigating cross-cultural, cross-religious worlds as a Muslim, while also leaving open the possibility that others stay who they are, and perhaps simply learn to coexist with respect, and maybe even a little admiration. This is useful for Yemeni Americans interacting among themselves, especially given the ways in which religion has become politicized. But it's also obviously useful for us to know about. Number two, we're missing out on the opportunity to learn about where coffee has come from under the stewardship of Yemenis, as well as Yemeni and Muslim Americans, if we don't devote a little extra effort to understanding its Islamic dimensions. Why? Because I think we risk flattening much of the cultural vitality that coffee has brought to Muslim life worlds, and how these worlds can help us all live in better ways. And here I turn to Mukhtar al-Hanjali, who's such an interesting advocate. And you see that from the book that Dave has written about his fascinating life and all of the different ways that Mukhtar is a very complicated and interesting person, very thoughtful. I mean, he's brilliant. But so he has a blog. His blog is really fascinating. It's, in July of this past year, he posted an entry called Baghdad by the Bay, a hauntological tour of San Francisco. And, you know, he cites French philosopher Jacques Derrida in his concept of hauntology, which Al-Hanjali glosses as, quote, lost, dead futures that can haunt the present, unquote. He takes readers on a quick photographic tour of buildings and monuments in the Bay Area that evoke Arab and Islamic cultures, and writes, quote, "We imagine the futures that could have been conceived had we been there, when we and our religion were seen as intellectual, spiritual, creative, enlightening, and profound." Because somewhere along the line, starting in the 1970s and percolating until its boiling point in September 2001, we came to be seen as different, unquote. He says in this blog that the hauntology kind of has come to haunt not just Muslims as they try to relate to this wonderful past and then think about the present and how it kind of haunts them. But also, he says, it's Marxism in Europe is subject to hauntology. He said it also died sometime earlier in the past century and has come to haunt the region in its current post-Soviet conflicts. If you recall in the book, Dave mentions Hunterly reading Das Kapital. I'm kind of reading it, it's finally chapter. Okay, Hunterly is clearly interested in a critique of capitalism. On the PBS NewsHour, one of his favorite sayings, maybe he said it to you, when he came here: "Oil powers factories and machines, coffee powers humans and dreams." So, Mukhtar's a big coffee merchant, but also he has things to say. Right? He has things to say about Muslims and kind of activism. He's been very involved. And he's like many Americans, Yemeni Americans, who are being actively involved in today in California and our area, both with coffee shops, but also kind of bringing that to positive change. In coffee, you say, like 70% of workers in the world, coffee farmers in the world, are paid less than like $2 a day. Yeah. 70% of all the workers are paid $2 a day. So when you pay for a cup of coffee that's $2-3, that is not like, we should be paying more for your cup of coffee. If you can find ways to pay more, usually those are folks that are involved with direct trade kinds of empowerment relations, and so it's worth thinking about. And all of these Yemeni coffee shops are doing the right thing in that respect. Another entry that Mukhtar came up with on his blog is called "Coffee, the Sister of Time," and it was published a day after July 4th, and he admits that he never really enjoyed American Independence Day. His discomfort was magnified the past year by the memory of his being in Sana'a as American-made bombs fell overhead. His way forward in this blog is to translate and share a poem by Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish, and it begins, quote, this is Darwish now, and he's translated it. I want the smell of coffee. This is a famous poem by Darwish. I want nothing more than the smell of coffee, and I don't want from all my days other than the smell of coffee. The smell of coffee to hold on to stand on my feet, to turn from an animal that crawls into a human, to stand my share of this dawn on its feet. Let's go together this day and I to the street in search of another place. And the poem goes on. It's very interesting to me. Al-Hunchali is citing Darwish in this way. And Darwish, I think, is saying here that coffee, actually Darwish does say in the poem, is the public reading of the open book of the soul. And I think by that he's meaning that coffee connects people who might not otherwise feel like they share much in common, but it connects them in their very human experiences that, while very intimate, might also serve as touchstones for their collective future. The poem is long, but to paraphrase the way some of its verses work in this way, Darwish says that coffee with a coriander taste has traditionally been understood by Palestinians to indicate that the preparer's kitchen may not be as tidy as it could be. Coffee with a carob flavoring signals the owner of the house is stingy. A mossy taste, the preparer is a left-winger. Antiquity from too much stirring, a right-winger, and so forth. So I take hunchily to be, through his careful translation of this wonderful poem, that coffee can be one of the important avenues through which Muslim Americans can rediscover their beautiful and complicated relationships with each other. I think that's Darwish is saying that too. And that acts of remembering through ethical coffee consumption can do important solidarity work. So there are differences, right? That for Darwish, it's like coffee is telling you signs of judgment. You're able to get a judgment. Maybe it's not so good about someone else, but still, it's a way of acknowledging the differences, maybe your own attitudes, and coming out with a better person. Anyway, thank you to the Friends of the Aptos Library and all of the associates who put together this event, and for bringing a conversation about Islam and what Islam is doing in the world to a more informed place. A place that gives a little more insight to some of the rich cultural heritage that coffee can offer to those of us looking to find peace-building skills and a way to talk across the aisle. You know, solidarity with Yemen is so important, and it can be done through reading and good books. It can be done here in California, which has such an incredible coffee history and coffee present, like so much of these new coffee initiatives. And yeah, thanks especially to David Mukhtar, wherever you are, for all of your work. Thank you for making me part of it.